less than or equal to the FERS situation when they go under the FICA program, so it's not some excessive part on that. And I go back to the point of, if we're going to do equity with people, then the retirement benefit should be comparable to what they would get if they hadn't been injured or hadn't become ill. And this bill doesn't do this. This bill reduces those benefits because it doesn't account for the fact that all of those other contributions they would have been making, whether it's into the thrift savings or into their retirement benefits or whatever, aren't available to them under this program. July 10th. It's not light years ago. They did pass a part of the bill that dealt with all the things that had consensus, and they sent it out to be studied by the General Accountability Office. The Office of Personnel Management weighed in. The Congressional Research Service weighed in, and they were working on a bill. We're only a few days removed from that, and they're the part of the committee with jurisdiction. I think that they've already said the extra, something that we haven't really done at length here. And they should be allowed to, carry out their business where they have the jurisdiction on that and take into consideration all of this. It's not to say there won't be changes, and some might not lean in the direction that you or the Senate have gone or whatever, but they will at least not put these people in a situation where they are going to be worse off than they otherwise would be. That's not the way I think we want to treat our employees.
Reclaiming my time. I strongly support the amendment offered by Mr. Attorney 48 that require the Postal Service to remove postal employees from existing federal workers' compensation system and place them in a postal-specific workers' compensation system. The Chairman's bill would not just remove the postal workers from the existing FICA system, the workers' compensation system that would be created under the, and it would automatically transition workers into retirement benefits when they reach retirement age. These provisions would have the effect of significantly reducing the workers' compensation benefits available to a postal employee below those provided to all other government employees under FICA. I oppose the creation of two separate, disparate workers' compensation systems for federal employees, and I oppose reducing the benefits for injured postal workers in the manner envisioned in the Chairman's bill. Such provisions are not in any way essential to placing the Postal Service on sound financial footing. I urge members to support the Attorney amendment to remove these provisions from the postal reform legislation, and I yield back to the gentleman for any further comments he may have.
Thank you. I just keep wanting to point out, since 1916, the motivating factor of having that Federal workers would be no better off and no worse off than that they have not been injured and not been made ill in the job. I think when you compare what the underlying bill, Section 306, does, is it makes them substantially worse off. That doesn't account for things, and I think we can do a better job on that, but I think the Committee of Jurisdiction, who can spend the time and get the hearings and have the information on that, would be the Committee of Primary Jurisdiction, the Education and Workforce Committee. They are in the process of working that. They've got part of the job done, and they're working on the other part of that, and I think we have that obligation to our people. Why we would take away benefits and then spend 4 times the amount of money to set up a system to support this amendment, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Reclaiming my time and yielding to the Chairman.
Thank you. The underlying bill does not take away any benefits. I want to make that very clear. However, and I can't imagine spending 4 times as much. We may spend more on administration, no question at all, but we would certainly not spend 4 times as much on the total package. Having said that, I'd like to go with the gentleman through, because you may very well be an inside and outside conferee both, the intention of how we'd like this bill to go. We pass this bill out, pass reference. We and our counterpart, which Senator Carper, would be the inside conferees. It is likely that Ed and Workforce would be our committee because of our Title 39 authority in postal, and of course Ed and Workforce for the other 50% of disabled Federal workers that would be dealing with what the Senate currently expects to have, which is a government-wide all Federal employees. Based on the previous work agreed to on a bipartisan basis, they would carefully deal with fully disabled versus partially disabled, existing versus new. And I know the gentleman looked undoubtedly in detail at the work that was done in the last Congress by Senator Lieberman and Senator Collins. So our goal, our legislation, is to create that place marker to where we go in. We're able to be in the conference as to our employees, the postal workers, and the fact that the postmaster and the postal union support, in some cases, postal-specific remedies would be on the table. The truth is that we'll pick up where we have exclusive jurisdiction. we will be able to create the savings where the Post Office would have no reason to want to go it separately. And in fact, the hybrid of reform government-wide, which we do not have the jurisdiction over, would in fact come back from the conference with the likelihood that Ed would have an outside conferee and would be voted as a conference report. Now, that's quite a dance, but we wrote ours so that we would maintain the ability to either mend it or go a separate way. Here, the same as the postmasters appeared before this committee talking about pulling out of our health care system if, in fact, the Post Office can get a substantial savings. Each of these areas are ones in which I have no special language, but in fact are trying to create the language that lets us have an effective conference. I actually look forward to the possibility that you will represent the other committee and that we can, in fact, deal with this so that we get the government-wide solution. I have talked to Chairman Klein, and I look forward to working with him because I believe you're exactly correct, and probably the most salient point you made, which is the expertise there is very clear, and we hope through this process. But we do expect that the Senate, which wants to deal with the entire government, and we who simply want to make sure the Post Office gets such reforms as save money while dealing through. So I know the gentleman has concerns, but I believe that you will see over the period of time from now till this becomes law that we are dealing in very good faith to try to have a bipartisan, bicameral solution, hopefully for the entire workforce, and hopefully without that other committee being in any way disenfranchised. We want them at the table. And I thank the gentleman for yielding. The question now occurs on the amendment. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the Chair, the noes have it. The gentleman's requested a recorded vote pursuant to, gentleman from Massachusetts, pursuant to committee rules. That will be delayed, postponed. Does anyone else seek to raise? The gentleman from Texas seeks recognition.
Thank you very much. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2748, offered by Mr. Farenthold of Texas.
The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment as it's being distributed.
Thank you very much. This is a relatively technical corrections. What we've got basically is the Postal Service already publishes a detailed annual report on Form 10K. As a matter of practice, the Postal Service conforms to generally accepted accounting principles. My amendment would clarify that the financial plan and budget prepared during the control period in the bill must apply with GAAP as well. It also makes two technical corrections to the underlying bill to fix incorrect cross-references, and it also, the GAAP provision financial hurdles, it adds a section 703 dealing with fair stamp evidencing competition. Basically, several private companies have pioneered alternative methods of showing or indicating postage on things that are shipped. This would prohibit the Postal Service from undercutting that and coming up with their own projects that doesn't live up to the standards they're holding the outside company to. So the Post Office needs to live up to the same standards that it holds private companies to. That's basically what I've got there. I urge my colleagues to support it, and yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize the ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, we support the amendment. It's a good amendment.
No more need to be said. If there's no one need to say it, then the question occurs on the amendment offered from the gentleman from Texas. All those in favor say aye. Any opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I believe I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment. The gentleman.
We have three.
This is the one on delivery point modernization to strike Section 102.
Amendment to H.R. 2748,
I ask
offered
unanimous
by
consent
Mr.
that the
Lynch.
amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my amendment would strike Section 102 of the underlying bill entitled Delivery point modernization. This is the section that we've talked about a little earlier today about basically the bill as it stands now would phase out almost all door-to-door delivery in favor of a virtually wholesale conversion to curbside or cluster box delivery of mail. In particular, the legislation introduced by the Chairman would mandate the conversion of at least 30 million addresses out of the approximately 37.8 million addresses that currently receive delivery of mail at the door. And that conversion would happen by the year 2022. To this end, a bill that purports to rein in Postal Service costs would authorize $1 billion towards a delivery modernization fund that would be used to create these cluster box and cover the expenses associated with the conversion process. Moreover, the version of H.R. 2748 under consideration today goes beyond the delivery point modernization language included in the Chairman's previous discussion draft by adding a requirement that postal customers pay a so-called legacy fee in order to continue to get their mail delivered at the door at an address that would not otherwise have been converted to a different mode of mail delivery. In support of my amendment to strike Section 102, I would first underscore the impracticality and likely counterproductive costs associated with conversion to curbside or cluster box delivery, particularly in densely settled urban areas, whether it be Boston, my city, or New York, Baltimore, Chicago, Houston, you name it. There's probably 30 cities I could name. If my own congressional district is any indication of how unfeasible and costly the elimination of door-to-door delivery would be for the Postal Service in heavily populated areas, the implementation and effect of this proposal would be significantly undermined by a lack of available city land. Let me talk about my district for a little bit. I live in South Boston. That community was settled in direct response to the potato famine in Ireland. The Irish that settled that area and Italians and Polish in later years built a structure called a triple-decker. It's basically three-family housing stacked on one another. And in order to jam as many people into those neighborhoods as possible, they attach the houses side to side. So there's no square foot of area in that town to look. The parking situation is a good index of how bad things are. Right now, when I come home at night after my job as a congressman, I have a bicycle rack on the back of my car. Now, there is no parking when I get home if I get home after 5 o'clock at night because all these people own cars. So I have a bicycle rack. I drop my wife and daughter off. I take my bicycle, I put her on the back of my car, and I drive about 2 miles to try to find a parking spot. And then I park my car wherever I can, probably 2 miles away, and then I ride my bike back to my house. It's ridiculous. There's no land available. So, I can understand people in rural areas. They say, what's the problem with setting up a cluster box? You would have to knock houses down in my area, in my neighborhood, in order to build cluster boxes. This will not work. It will not work. I understand in some of the other neighborhoods in Manhattan, I know they have 30-story apartment buildings, 50-story, 60-story, and cluster boxes are available or feasible in those, but we have a lack of available city land. And this bill completely ignores the reality of places like where I live. You would actually, as I say, have to knock down houses in order to make this work, and we're not going to do that. In light of the annual $353 per address for door-to-door delivery versus a $224 address cost for curbside delivery and $160 per address for cluster box delivery, there's an underlying rationale here. However, as in the case of the proposed elimination of 6-day mail delivery, I am strongly concerned that we are not properly factoring in the negative business impact that would result from a significant decline in the delivery of services. A lot of my district is urban area. We've got some rough neighborhoods. I think that seniors and others, families with kids, would be, I think, exposed to a certain amount of danger in traveling a pretty good distance away to get there, to retrieve their mail from a cluster box several blocks away. I think it would create situations of great vulnerability for those families and those seniors. And I think it also undermines the strength of the Postal Service because of the elimination of a key business advantage that the Postal Service holds now over its customers, over its competitors. In addition, I note during his testimony before our committee last week, the Postmaster General himself did not express great certainty that a shift to curbside and cluster box delivery would in fact be a definitive means of enhancing the financial viability of the Postal Service. He said that changes in customer services are probably the biggest things that upsets customers. And I would add that postal customers will also be upset if we require them to pay this legacy fee and thereby bear the cost of retaining the free door delivery, which up to now has been free to them and to which they've become accustomed. So, look, there's no availability for cluster boxes in many communities around the country. There's no accommodation that we can make to those people because it's just not feasible. So what we're going to do to those people is, okay, if we can't put a cluster box in because you live in a densely settled area, we're going to charge you a fee to have your mail delivered. And all I'm asking for is the same courtesy that I've been willing to afford people in rural areas. I haven't asked to have rural post offices closed. Matter of fact, you know, I think there's an enhanced...
Is the gentleman...
I'm sorry?
The gentleman's time is expiring. Has
Oh,
expired.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Close to...
Let me wrap up. I'm sorry, sir. I thought it was still counting down. I apologize, Mr. Meehan. I'll shut up now. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment. You know, this is a great, big, diverse country with all sorts of different areas that the Postal Service has done a phenomenal job of serving. I've had the pleasure of visiting Boston on numerous occasions. One of my daughters attended school outside of Boston, and I can't imagine cluster boxes in some of the historical districts that I've walked through on the streets of Boston. But you go to other suburban in particular, or even Texas cities where everybody has a car and we're not nearly as dense. You stop by the cluster boxes, you drive home, it's a block or two away from your house. We've made specific accommodations in the bill to deal with the unique geography that may be in certain areas. We've made conditions where...
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I totally respect the gentleman, and I've worked with him on the subcommittee, and he's done a great job. And I just want to point out that we only deliver to 37 million households right now, and the bill calls for eliminating 30 million of it. Okay, so that's the vast majority of people who are getting their mail. Okay, go ahead.
The bill specifically says that the Postal Service needs to take into consideration in determining whether or not to switch or install the impact of weather conditions, physical barriers, which I would consider to be the lack of a place to put the cluster boxes in areas that say that have row houses. I mean, these are specific exceptions that gives the Postal Service the ability to continue the door delivery where there isn't a spot for the cluster boxes. It also specifically exempts the elderly and disabled, where if there are special needs for free, they can still continue to have the mail delivered to their house. Believe me, my wife would probably be happier if I had to walk a block or two to get my mail than having to just walk out to the curb. I'd probably be a little bit skinnier too, but that's not what we're here to do. What we're here to do is come up with some cost-saving measures for the post office, and all the numbers that I've consistently heard is this is a cost saver, and it makes common sense that that the less stops a mail carrier has to make on their route, the quicker they're going to do it, the more houses that their residences or businesses they're going to be able to cover. I think we've dealt with most of the concerns, and if there are other specific situations that you don't think are covered in the exception, let's get together and figure them out. But I think the language is pretty broad in saying if you can't do it or it doesn't make sense to do it in this neighborhood or that neighborhood, for whatever reason, weather, location, lack of location, the fact that it's a mile uphill to where and a mile back uphill we'll come up with a solution. We're trying to push towards this wherever we can, but we're not trying to inconvenience anybody. And back in the time, I didn't used to have to pay money to check a bag on the airplane. But as the economy's changed, things that used to come for free, we now have to pay for. But we certainly don't want to cut the level of service. We want to preserve the post office and save some money. And I'll yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Absolutely, I'll yield.
You did a wonderful job, and I agree with everything you have to say, and particularly the fact that we are making sure that, for example, Mr. Connolly's family, if that box really can't be found in a place that works, then it won't happen. But out of over 30 million residents that currently have in-the-door delivery, we suspect, we know, and the post office has confirmed, there are millions of locations in which people could get convenient and more secure locations. So I appreciate the gentleman for that. I'd like to also make a couple of quick announcements. Many members of this committee serve on judiciary. They're scheduling a 1 o'clock vote. It will be a series of votes. So the intent is we will take a short recess at that, shortly about that time. I'd also like to announce that we plan on doing a UC on one of the bills, which is the D.C. technical changes, and we're going to do that just before we break at 1 o'clock. It is very possible that a vote will be called for the House floor around 1:30. If that occurs, then we'll stay in recess till after that vote. So I want to try to make everything move as smoothly as possible, but a little of that creates a bit of a problem, and I would hope everyone can adjust their schedule. But we will vote on what we expect to be a UC, which is this D.C. technical correction, so that that is accomplished just before 1 o'clock. I want to make sure everyone is back for that if they want to physically vote on it. Ranking Member.
Thank you very much. On the amendment, I want to yield to Mr. Lynch for a moment. Mr. Lynch, I would like for you to comment a little bit further on the idea of in areas like Baltimore, where these cluster boxes would go, and then the whole concept of something being, I guess, introduced to our system, and that is that people actually paying extra costs to have something delivered to their door. Would you comment on those two things real quick?
Well, sure. I think it's one is just a practicality issue that some members of this committee think that the Postal Service will just use common sense and approach this in a way that will not diminish the services to people living in urban areas. The experience, however, with all due respect to the Postal Service, has not been that way. We've seen them close or attempt to close busy post offices while leaving others that are not used that frequently open. We've seen some things that have defied logic in terms of the post office, with all due respect. Secondly, on an issue of fairness, I have supported rural post offices and the folks in those areas not only to keep their post offices open, and there's language in this legislation that would limit closings in rural areas. And that's an accommodation that's being made for those folks in those areas, and I respect that, which means that 95% of the closings are going to have to happen in urban and suburban areas. And that's a burden that's going to be put on these same people who don't have an ability to have a cluster box in their area, but to retain door-to-door delivery, which they've had forever, they're going to have to pay a legacy fee. And I just see a shifting of the burden on to people in Baltimore and in Boston and in Chicago and New York. I see those people having to pay for this. You know, and there's $1 billion from the taxpayer, basically, because the credit limit is being extended by another $5 billion to the Postal Service to conduct this conversion. So I just see urban areas like you've talked about, Mr. Chairman, where you live and the people of Baltimore, carrying a greater share of the burden in this bill.
Reclaiming my time, the amendment offered by Mr. Lynch would strike Section 102 of the underlying bill. Section 102 requires the conversion of 30 million of the existing 37 million door delivery points to curbside or cluster box delivery by 2022, essentially phasing out door delivery in the United States. However, as I mentioned earlier, Section 102 will allow households to pay a fee if they want to continue receiving door delivery. In essence, the underlying bill would create two categories of postal patrons among those who currently receive door delivery: those who can afford to continue receiving such delivery and those who cannot. We have no idea of what the impact of the elimination of door delivery would be on mail volumes. However, on our side of the aisle, we are clear that we do not need to create a Cadillac service that would require some customers to pay for the convenience of door delivery while forcing all other households to move to a curbside or cluster box delivery location. I urge members to adopt this amendment, and I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield for a second?
Of course.
From a technical standpoint, I'd like to make it clear, this provision to pay is if you have a cluster box and you still want to have door delivery. For those 7 million that, like Mr. Connolly, or actually Mr. Lynch's constituents, Mr. Connolly's parents, if they're in an area in which a cluster box cannot be worked out, there is no pay. They get their door delivery. The premium comes when you are afforded something at your street or nearby, and you choose to still want to have that. So please understand that 7 million was an arbitrary number, but we believed it was large enough to cover Mr. Lynch's area of his district that may not be convertible within that mandate of 2022. So hopefully that's technically understood.
Thanks for clarifying it.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Utah moves to strike last word. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, and I appreciate the caring and good work of the member from Massachusetts. I stand in opposition, though, to his amendment, because as I read the bill, the underlying bill, which I think is well crafted, there are plenty of procedures, considerations, waivers, so that the hardships that have been articulated would not come about. Starting on page 8, procedures to solicit, consider, and respond to input from postal patrons, state and local governments, local association of property owners, place centralized delivery points at locations to maximize delivery, ease of postal patrons, and respect for private property, consideration for impact on weather conditions and those types of factors, an understanding that there may be a registered historic district, and then point C on page 9, population density and the concentration of poverty, which may also be considerations. There are waivers for physical hardships. There's door delivery is necessary in order to avoid causing significant physical hardship to a particular postal patron is written directly into the piece of legislation. Those types of things, I think, would be the assurances if there's something that the gentleman wants to strengthen those. But I see a very well-rounded, well-crafted, comprehensive approach to providing the types of waivers for an unusually dense population that wouldn't create the type of problems that maybe you have in South Boston, but maybe work for the whole rest of the country. And the reality is we're going to have to cut some costs. We just have to cut some costs. So I think this provision, the amendment is not warranted in this case. I think the bill does an exceptional job of laying this out. And yes, I'd be happy to yield.
You know, we're going to cut some costs, but when it comes to closing post offices in rural areas, we said, you know what, that's a burden we don't want to put on those people. So we said in this legislation we're not going to.
Reclaiming my time, there are provisions there that I think we will be cutting some, But there have got to be things, for instance, proximity should be part of the consideration, and there are considerations in this bill for dealing with rural post offices, just as there are for considerations in dealing with cluster boxes. Now, I happen to have a lot of my rural area that do have cluster boxes, and still people have to go miles to get to those cluster boxes. In my own hometown, where I go, if I want to mail a letter, I got about a mile I've got to go in order to mail that letter. But that's just the way we do it out there. Now, we're a newer neighborhood. We're not dealing with the 100-year legacy that maybe South Boston is, but this bill provides for exceptions. And I just listed out the whole set of exceptions.
Gentlemen, this is my point.
I'd be happy to yield.
When the decision to close down post offices, which is also, a cost factor, when that issue was raised, the chairman accepted an amendment to say, okay, only 5% will come from rural areas. The other 95% will come from elsewhere. So it's just an accommodation around costs and who will bear the burden of those costs that has been rendered favorably to people in rural areas. All I'm asking for is fairness. That's all.
And reclaiming my time, in the spirit of fairness, I think the bill outlines a number of exceptions so that neighborhoods, as you've described, that may be right in your district or literally in your neighborhood, would not be adversely affected. I would also point back to the hearing that we had most recently. I complained that we weren't closing enough posts. I got a post office in my district in one of my largest cities that we want to close. There was a fire. You can't even have access to it. And these poor people at the Postal Service are so afraid of closing this post office and moving it to a different facility, it's harming the patrons of the Postal Service, and it's a problem. So every situation is unique. You can come across the whole gambit. I guess what I'm saying to the gentleman from Massachusetts, what other waivers and exceptions do you need? Because I think it is well-crafted. It is well-rounded. There are a host of exceptions here, but to just say we're not going to do cluster boxes, I find unacceptable as well.
Well, gentlemen, just for last,
Sure.
It's ironic that you're saying, let's trust the post office, they'll do the right thing, and then the other breath you say, they won't even close a post office in my district that people can't get to. So
Reclaiming my time. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the law, as we're proposing, is going to change. It's going to change, and it's going to give them a host of exceptions that they should consider in going through this process. But yeah, we're going to push them to get to the point, something they've actually been asking for, many of them, to become more effective, more efficient, and ultimately help the very people that you're concerned about, because we can't just keep raising prices and limiting their services. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Illinois seek recognition. Strike the last word. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I shall be very brief because I don't want to rehash the discussion. I agree with some of the points that are made on both sides of the argument. My concern has nothing to do with urban and rural, and I don't know if you get any more urban than Chicago, Illinois. That's pretty urban. But my concern is what happens to the workforce, what happens to the letter carriers who are put out of work with no replacement opportunities. And I think as we make decisions about cutting and getting the most out of what it is that we do, that we have to consider all components and the consequences of what we do. I have no problem with cutting where we must and when we must, but I can tell you when you cut, you get blood, and somebody's going to end up bleeding. I'm in favor of the Lynch amendment. And
Would the gentleman yield? Well,
yes.
We have representatives of the Post Office, including the Deputy Postmaster, a former colleague of all of ours. They can give anyone numbers. The intent of the cluster conversion is it will actually increase efficiency slower than the rate of attrition of the letter carriers. So it is not the Chair's intent nor the Postmaster's plan to have to do or expect to do anything other than through attrition in these areas be able to have that. So I know the gentleman There are areas like processing plants that may be a different story, but in the case of these urban deliveries, it's just the opposite. Today, we have not been able to offer buyouts or anything else to letter carriers who might otherwise retire because we actually don't have the efficiencies that would allow a reduction. So the intent is to have this phased in between now and 2022 in a way that would allow letter carriers to retire and not be replaced in some cases, but no letter carrier would lose their job as a result of this efficiency.
Will the gentleman yield?
It's the gentleman's time.
Thank you. The Chairman completely ignores the reduction from 6-day to 5-day. That's going to reduce tens of thousands of jobs for letter carriers around this country. So the idea that we're going to phase this out so that we can only do this through attrition is completely laughable. You're going from 6-day to 5-day delivery, which will eliminate tens of thousands of post office jobs, letter carrier jobs. I yield back.
If the gentleman yield just one more quick second. I share with the gentleman the concern, and the Postmaster has testified before this committee that it would be temporary positions and others, and that he would not need nor ask for RIFT authority or anything else in order to do the 6 to 5 day. That was an assurance by the Postmaster. I didn't find him laughable, but I'll hold him to that no letter carrier, no consideration of letter carriers losing their jobs, that only as he structured in his testimony would occur, and hopefully all of us will hold him to that.
Will the gentleman yield?
Mr. Chair.
Yes. I would ask unanimous consent. The gentleman have an additional 30 seconds. So, or actually, he has time. Go ahead and yell it.
I thank the gentleman. Well, if we're not seeking reduction in force authority, why in the bill do you seek reduction in force authority?
I'll yield.
Gentleman, yield. Thank you. We don't seek it during the term of the contract. We seek to harmonize it with the rest of the Federal workforce on their renegotiation. Candidly, we don't predict what will come out of those negotiations, and my understanding is that it would be a procedure that would allow them to deal with a processing center that may be closed, in which it would be more than 50 miles between another one. But that's in another section of the bill. I'm sure the gentleman may have an amendment on that.
Mr. Chairman, I'm ready to yield back, but
May I?
yes.
Well, you know, in addition, the actual provision that you have in the bill prohibits any restrictions on any restrictions on reductions in force in future contracts. It doesn't leave it open. It strictly prohibits it in your bill.
Well, let me just say this as I yield. As we talk about fairness, I'm often reminded of a question that my father used to ask, and he'd say, is it fair for birds to eat worms? You get one answer from the birds. You get another answer from the worms. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for that sage remark. If there are no further—
Mr. Chairman, I'm seeking recognition on the amendment.
Steve, you need more time? The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the Chair. First of all, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Fahrenholt was out of the room, but I do want to thank him as the subcommittee chair. He's been fair and inclusive, and I certainly appreciate, and I know Mr. Lynch does, trying to work in a cooperative fashion, and as a colleague, I appreciate it. But two things I would say to my friend from Texas. He says that he had a daughter who went to school in Boston, and that perhaps South Boston might not have room for cluster boxes, but the suburbs do. Well, I'd be glad to take my friend from Texas to Charleston, Dorchester, Chelsea, Alston, Brighton, West Roxbury, throughout the city of Boston, even the Back Bay. And you will be hard-pressed to find many places in the city of where cluster boxes would work. Now, my friend from Texas and my friend from Utah cite all of the waivers that would be allowed by the bill, but the bill's language, nonetheless, is quite direct. And I read, not later than September 30th, 2022, the Postal Service shall convert not less than 30 million of the door delivery points extant on December 31, 2012. It's pretty clear. Now, there is something Mr. Lynch has referred to as a legacy fee. And that bothers me as much as anything. My friend from Utah would not welcome a provision in a bill that required his constituents to pay a special fee because it costs more to deliver mail in rural Utah than it does in South Boston. So let's have a differential fee. In fact, the only group singled out for paying for a service they currently now get are urban dwellers.
Will
We have home
will the
delivery.
gentleman yield?
I would gladly yield to my friend.
And the intent, and if it's not perfectly worded, maybe we can find a solution to this, is that the legacy fee is not going to apply if we determine there can't be a cluster box in your neighborhood for respective private property rights or whatever. You're in Mr. Chaffetz's district where there's, or in a new suburb.
Reclaiming my time. I
Will the gentleman
understand the
yield?
point.
Will the gentleman yield?
In a minute. I understand the point, but only this group is singled out for a fee at all, for mail they currently get now. Why are we discriminating in a bill against urban dwellers?
Will the
While,
gentleman yield?
and then I will, while, by the way, protecting, as Mr. Lynch pointed out, by accepting Adrian Smith's bill, protecting a certain class of people from anything beyond 5%.
Will the
And
gentleman
that is a
gentleman yield?
huge cost shift. I will first yield to my friend from Utah and then, of course, yield to the chairman.
Pony Express actually went through Utah. We got a great trail that went through there. So I got homes that date back to the 1800s that have had a lot of this type of delivery. We have newer neighborhoods. We're one of the fastest growing states. But I think you're making a huge assumption that it's more expensive to do this in a rural setting where our costs of goods and services and personnel and everything else is a lot less expensive than I'm sure that it is in Boston.
Reclaiming my time, my friend from Utah may have a point. Let's hold off on adopting this provision and adopt Mr. Lynch's provision to excise it while we actually get analytical data to prove his point.
Will the gentleman yield?
I would.
I would totally disagree with that. I think
course.
there is analytical data. There are plenty of
I reclaim
exceptions
my
out
time.
there.
I am not surprised. I now yield to the chairman who has asked me to yield.
Yes, I just want to make sure that we all understand. We're happy to strike that provision that you can pay even if you have a cluster box at the front of your lot. We're happy to strike that if it offends people. We put it in order to assure people that if you wanted a premium service, fine, but it is a premium service. In Carmel, California, not exactly a poor inner city area, and in Rancho Santa Fe, California, they don't deliver to the house, the door, or the curb. You've got to go to the post office downtown, and it's been that way for decades. There are all kinds of different services around the country, and I think the important thing is, for example, I grew up at 3637 Annisdale in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, and it's not a dense urban area, but it was built in the 30s, and as a result, we had in-the-chute delivery. It's never been converted. It is easily convertible. It hasn't happened. Now, if somebody tells me that the right number of exclusions is 8 million, not 7 million, this chair is fully prepared to participate in a change. But the estimate is that the vast majority of these can be done and done to improve the delivery service, and we created a fund in order to do it. We did put this premium service in
Mr. Chairman,
as a courtesy.
reclaiming my time just for a minute, how does the chairman know the vast majority can be done? Is there a study he can point to?
Yes, there has.
Well, can I see that study?
The Deputy Postmaster is here. I'm sure his staff will be perfectly willing to let you know that since 1974, as they've looked at the conversions, they tell us that it is, with not having a mandate, there is generally hard to sell people on proactively wanting it, but they have long list of communities that could be done that have not been done that would pay for themselves in less than 3 years.
I will, Mr. Chairman, I know we're over. I'll be glad to look at that, but count me a skeptic on vast majority. But I'll be looking forward to the Postal Service providing such data. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The question now occurs on the amendment offered from the gentleman, by the gentleman from Massachusetts. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed, no? No. In the opinion of the Chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
After roll call.
A roll call being requested pursuant to the rule will be postponed.
Mr. Chairman, I
For
have
what
an amendment.
purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, prior to the reading of the amendment at the desk, if I might ask for a courtesy, just a quick colloquy.
The gentleman is recognized.
On a point of clarification, and this isn't an amendment to the bill, but it's actually in my own reading of the bill itself. I have been made aware in my own district of the concept of work share, in which one of the large employers has actually worked in concert with the Postal Service, in which they have participated in the packaging of mail and then been able to deliver it to the Postal Service in a manner in which it can then be more effectively mailed. And as a result, they've gotten a reduced rate. I just want to be sure that this concept, which I think has actually enabled the Postal Service to increase the volume of mail and to more effectively compete against alternative ways to delivery, so that the concept of work share is not prohibited by this bill.
That's correct. We support that, and the bill does not limit work share. And I agree with the gentleman that it is a postal prerogative that they enjoy and use extensively.
I thank the Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I do have an amendment at the desk.
Okay, the
It's,
gentlelady,
amendment number
the clerk
20.
will read the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2748, offered by Mr. Meehan of Pennsylvania.
The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Okay, I thank you, Mr. Chairman. It may be fortuitous that this is an issue that arises in the context of the previous discussion that we just had, because I too represent a district, much like the gentleman from Massachusetts, which goes from traditional row homes, which are built on homes and streets, oftentimes in which it's concrete from end to end, and also it moves out through a suburban district where there is a legacy of door-to-door delivery. And what I think it speaks to the point that what we really need here in this process is transparency, greater community input, to avoid sort of the one-size-fits-all approach to changes in this Postal Service delivery points. The underlying bill requires the Postal Service to transition, as has been stated, 30 million people and businesses away from door-to-door delivery to either curbside or this cluster box. These are some significant changes, Mr. Chairman, and the delivery not only for the communities of my district, for communities all across the nation. And so what I'm looking for is a way in which this can be accomplished with genuine transparency and the recognition that the promised savings are actually going to be realized. And so I ask for 3 steps that be done. First, that the amendment will require a minimum of a public community meeting prior to the commencement of any delivery conversion. So if they're going to walk into a community and say, we know we can save X dollars by converting to, the cluster box, then I'm asking that the Postal Service have to have a community meeting and justify that. And at the conclusion, a subsequent community meeting, by the time they actually reach a final decision. Those 2 opportunities would allow the community to have input. And also, if there is a change during the process, because I've suffered from representations that have been made about the Postal Service in which they say these are the criteria in which we've made a determination, and then unilaterally, when it doesn't show itself to be the case, they will change and make a decision apart from the very savings that they projected in the first place. So this will require community input and justification. The second piece of that justification being that the Postal Service will calculate for that region where they're making the cluster box suggestion what kind of cost savings they're going to realize on average per the postal patrons, and also on average for whatever state or municipal government may be impacted by that, recognizing that some of them may have to incur costs in order to accommodate this. And lastly, that the Inspector General conduct an audit on the annual report and submit it to Congress on those conversion efforts along the points that I have made. This will allow these things to be done on a principled basis, and while it may in fact accomplish some of the goals that my the gentleman from the other side have raised about accountability. I do want to see accountability, too. I think people are going to be willing to accommodate some of this if, in fact, it's going to be genuine savings, and if, in fact, there's going to be the ability for certain kinds of things like a senior citizen or others to be recognized about the unique issues that may rise if you're asking a senior citizen to have to travel some distance now to simply get their mail each day. So this amendment allows there to be a measure of accountability, a measure of oversight, and a measure of transparency and community input in these very real decisions, and that community input and transparency be down to the local level where these issues are being resolved on the part of the Postal Service. So, Mr. Chairman, I ask that that my colleagues on this committee support this amendment.
The gentleman yields.
Yes, I will.
Just one question. I've read your amendment, and one of the things that, having been in public life now over 30 years, is when you bring the public together, a lot of times you create an expectation. And I don't, first of all, I think the amendment, it's better to have the amendment than not. I want to make that clear. But I'm wondering if there's no veto power, are we setting the public up? Let's say the public goes crazy and says, no, the hell no. People are reluctant to change. They say, the post office has been operating this way for 50 million years. I mean, what impact can they have? I don't want to give them a false hope either. You follow what I'm saying?
Well, I do follow what you're saying, but I think the impact will be the facts themselves. I mean, that's going to be the best case. We've got to, I'm trying to accommodate the ability for local people to be able to demonstrate how a decision made on the location of a cluster box or some other kind of thing, the neighborhood itself will have the opportunity on the front end. When it's proposed, they will have the chance to weigh in. So I believe that the idea that there won't be any input it would not be realized. In fact, they would have input on the front end, but it would also require the Postal Service to be able to justify to them that we have projected these savings to occur simultaneously. Look, a community may say it's not an inconvenience, but like the gentleman from Massachusetts, I anticipate that there's going to be numbers of occasions where I've got a lot of senior citizens that have been living in row homes for a series of years, and this is going to be a difficult challenge for them.
I recognize myself in support of the amendment. The amendment clarifies and expands the requirement of the Postal Service when it implements door delivery conversion. What I think is particularly important that the gentleman's amendment does add, and I think the gentleman from Massachusetts would agree, that in fact the requirement to solicit, consider, and respond to input from the community and local governments is embedded in the amendment. Additionally, because the Postal Inspector General has a requirement to perform an annual audit, which we in this committee would receive, it is clear that that input, if not heeded, would in fact be in that annual report to Congress. So I see both the mechanism for transparency, the mechanism and requirement for input, and because it has a requirement for responding to that input, that response be meaningful and accurate. I believe that this will ensure an improved selection of sites, and in some cases may cause cities that cannot find an acceptable solution to have portions of it not converted as the underlying bill requires. So I want to thank the gentleman for his thoughtful enhancement and the level of transparency, and particularly the protections of the Inspector General. This amendment, I believe, as the ranking member said, this bill is better for having it in it than not, and I would recommend it. I'd yield to the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank the gentleman for the amendment. I think it does, without a doubt, improve the legislation, no doubt about it. I still have my underlying concerns, the same one that Mr. Lynch so eloquently stated. I'm going to support the amendment. But again, still, we're still talking about 30 million conversions. So I don't know if Mr. Lynch, I yield to Mr. Lynch if he has a comment.
Well, I thank the gentleman. I also thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania for his amendment. I think it improves the bill. Thank you. Not to the point that I will vote for it, but it improves the bill.
But you'll vote for the amendment?
Oh, I support the amendment.
There we go.
Absolutely, yeah.
Does anyone want to pile on further? Mr.
I do, just for a moment.
That's all right. He'll take yes for an answer if it's short.
I'm generally supportive of the amendment. I do think it may need a little bit of tweaking before it goes to the House floor, because suppose as they go in to put the cluster box in or the centralized mail facility, they need to move it 2 or 3 feet one direction because there's a gas line or a power line. I don't think we should have to undergo the expense of a second public hearing for, insignificant changes. So I'm just a little bit concerned about there are a lot of shalls in there.
If the chairman would yield, I certainly look forward to working with the gentleman. I'm sure the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Meehan, would agree that we want to make sure the language allows for one round of input to the city, one round of input to the constituency, and technical small changes in the spirit of it be considered. And certainly we'd want to make sure that explicit requirement is in the IG reporting. So we'll work with the gentleman on that.
And,
Thank you very much.
Gentleman, yield?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm delighted to work with you. I think I do understand your point, and I'd be delighted to work on some kind of a clarification that would recognize that sort of a non-material change is not the thing that would
Trigger a second public hearing, right.
Mr. Chairman, I was just going to urge my friend from Pennsylvania, don't clarify it too much.
I thank the gentleman, and if the gentleman from Texas would yield for just another few seconds.
Certainly.
Or is it my time? It's my time. I'll yield to myself. Getting it right is so important. The fact that since the mid-'70s we've been under a conversion, and that it started off relatively well with hundreds of thousands of successful conversions and has slowed to a crawl, doesn't mean that we want to start it without making it better. At least as in my conversations with the Postmaster General and with his staff, the benefits of cluster boxes are the only reason that we're talking cluster boxes here today. I began speaking about this as a conversion to a box at the curb, and it was only the recognition that that historic box at the curb, including the gentleman from Utah's district, didn't accommodate that Amazon purchase, that in a modern age we really need larger secure storage. So that was the reason that we wanted to get it. It's also the reason that Mr. Meehan's amendment is so important, is that as these get to be 4, 5, and 6 homes and more, they become significant to the community. They be done right, be done in accordance with the community's wishes. So I thank the gentleman for his amendment. And if there's no further on this particular amendment, the question is on agreeing broadly to the gentleman from Pennsylvania's amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. I now recess that markup and ask unanimous consent that the committee favorably report to the House H.R. 2793, a bill to make technical corrections for the District of Columbia. And I want to make sure, before anyone all agrees on the UC, that you have copies of the bill. And while that's being distributed, I recognize the gentlelady from the District of Columbia.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the way in which you have tried, without fail, seeing that there were issues that no one in the Congress certainly would take exception to, but that remained outstanding, have tried to move us forward with the local budget process. The bill that you have introduced makes important technical changes to the District of Columbia budget process. I support the intent of the bill, and therefore I will support the unanimous consent conditioned on the discussions you and I have had on an agreement yet to be reached on the final language of the bill.
I thank the gentlelady, and I thank you for her past and continued work on getting this. And I particularly thank her for bringing to the attention of the committee the need to provide an appropriate level of flexibility for the selection of the new CFO and the pay necessary to do that. And I think your help in getting it here quickly so that we can deal with it at a time when we're actually searching for a new CFO for the city is critical. And then without objection, unanimous consent is favorably considered, and the bill is reported to the House. With that, we're going to stand in recess until immediately after the vote on the House floor.